Welcome, everyone. This is S.J. Thomason with ChristianApologist.com, and today I'm very excited to be here with Joel Edmund Anderson. And Joel is a PhD in biblical studies, and he's focused specifically on Old Testament, and he's going to be sharing some of his knowledge. So there really isn't anything better than that. So, Joel, I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to you if you'd like to introduce yourself and maybe say a little something for the audience.
Hi, I'm Joel. The only reason I go by Joel Edmund Anderson is because there's a few other Joel Andersons, and it's just my way of differentiating myself. But it's funny. It's like when people say Joel Edmund Anderson, I'm like, in my normal life, I don't go by that, but that's my title to, differentiate myself. But yeah, so we're both done with our college semesters, so I'm a little kind of on the detoxing from it, so I'm a little tired, but we'll kind of see how this goes. I see there's 2 people watching. Hi, 2 people watching.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's by phone or if they're watching where they'll be in a chat. Hopefully we can get conversation going in the chat as well.
Yeah, well, we're going to be open to any questions you may have. We can wing it. So
great. So I want to go ahead and ask you now. Lately, in our first discussion, we chatted about some of the historicity of the Bible and those kind of topics. And I think today, since then, you've written some more. You've given us some more information on Bart Ehrman and on Richard Carrier. I know that you've gotten in a little Twitter debate with Richard Carrier, and that's always entertaining. So, would you like to share some of the little nuggets from that research that you've done?
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, with the Richard Carrier stuff, it was funny because the way it got started was he had made a comment to you on your Twitter, and I just kind of hosted I wouldn't say snarky comment, but just kind of a funny comment on that. And it kind of went back and forth, and then we got into that huge Twitter battle that I wasn't really planning on. And therefore he kept on saying, you should read my book. You should read my book. And so I said, fine, I'll watch some of your lectures. And so I was watching some of his lectures, and then we had a few more Twitter conversations about the things I felt were wrong. He's like, oh, you're not going to read my book. And so I got a hold of his book, and I kind of read through it. Now, when I say read through, it's like 700 pages. There was a couple things I skimmed, but so I ended up reading through his book, and I ended up writing 4 blog posts on why he's wrong. And but then I kind of left it at that. It's amazing how once you write stuff, you kind of forget what were all the things I pointed out. So I'm gonna have to kind of
well, let me, because I've also written on his stuff, and I've looked at his blogs, but let's maybe start with some of the things that he's pointed out. Like, for example, one of the things that he said is that I think he thinks that all of these early Christians had a mass hallucination. And I think you might have written something on that.
Yeah, well, it's funny. It's because that's one of the things that Bart Ehrman kind of, not exactly the same, but they're trying to explain away how the early Christians could what their claim of the resurrection is. He really wasn't resurrected. There really wasn't an empty tomb because he probably really wasn't buried. That whole line of thinking. Actually, that's what I'm writing about Ehrman right now. Yeah. So therefore, if what you're faced with is if the early Christians claimed they saw a resurrected Jesus, and you don't believe he was resurrected, you have to account for that somehow. And that's why Carrier and Ehrman, to an extent, they claim that his early followers didn't really encounter a resurrected Jesus, that they just had visions of him after he died that brought comfort to them. And therefore that led them to believe that he was now exalted in heaven. And that's what they meant by resurrection. And of course, the problem with that is that take for example, when Paul, when he claims that Jesus was resurrected, Paul was a Pharisee. and the Pharisees' belief in resurrection meant physical resurrection. That's what it meant. And too often people who want to explain it away, they say, oh, what the Christians really meant was that he was just kind of resurrected spiritually and is now, floating in heaven with God. But the very definition of resurrection means physical resurrection. If it was the idea that Jesus physically died, but now he was a spirit in heaven, that's not what resurrection means. And so you can't, that's just a faulty understanding of resurrection. So you can't say that. That's historically, factually incorrect. And as far as the mass hallucination itself goes, I just don't know any real scholar who really believes that. At most, you get scholars like Bart Ehrman who claim that one or two of Jesus' followers probably had a visionary experience, and then they convinced everybody else that really happened, and that's how it started. But even that's kind of, sketchy.
I agree. Of course, I think that the information about Paul is actually highly relevant because Paul, like you said, was a Pharisee. It wasn't in Paul's best interest to suddenly become a Christian, and it certainly didn't work out terribly well for him when you think about how he was imprisoned, he was bitten by a snake, he was beaten and stoned, and everything else happened to Paul before he was finally beheaded. So this certainly wasn't something that he was doing because he wanted to make a quick buck.
Yeah. Well, and that's funny because that's one of the things that Richard Carrier says, which I just find so incredibly insane, is that he claimed that the earliest Christians were completely Torah observant Jews, and then that Paul then went out to Gentiles and he started making a lot of money, and then he brought money back to Jerusalem, and I'm paraphrasing what he said in one of his lectures here, but it's basically what he said. And then he came back to Jerusalem and showed the Jerusalem leaders all the money he was making because he was really raking in the dough. And they said, okay, you don't have to get them circumcised, but just keep giving us money. Who thinks that? I mean, that is just anybody who's just read Acts or read Paul's letters knows what a load of, poopy that is.
Yeah.
The money that he brought to Jerusalem was basically for famine relief. A basic reading of Acts tells you that. And then Richard Carrier takes that and, oh no, it wasn't famine relief. It was just because, he was a Robert Tilton type, televangelist guy who was just raking in the money. It's like, that is so insane. You can't even take that seriously.
Well, I think that goes to some of the strongest arguments that we have as far as the early Christians, because we have the arguments that, they didn't do it for money. They didn't do it for power. They were worshiping illegally. They had no legal protections. They were in many cases martyred. So this was not an easy life for any of them. And the other pretty interesting fact, and I'd love to think about what Carrier said about this, but what about Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, and Jesus' half-brother James, who also was very skeptical and actually tried to stop Jesus in his ministry early on? Both of those two did a complete 180 after they saw the risen Jesus, and they made it clear that they saw the risen Jesus. So I don't know how these people want to explain that away. They certainly can't say it was for the money, although it looks like Carrier did say it's for the money.
Yeah, well, Carrier does say that, but Carrier can't be taken seriously, and he isn't taken seriously by 99% of biblical scholars. But do you know what he says about James?
No, what did he say about James?
Carrier doesn't believe Jesus existed. It's all a myth, even though the way he uses that term drives me nuts because it's not the way scholars should use the term. But he claims that Jesus didn't exist, and therefore, when Paul talks about James, Jesus's brother, he didn't mean literal brother. He just means like the brethren, like fellow Christians. So James was just a fellow Christian he was referring to, not literally James, Jesus's brother. Of course, the problem with that is that you have in Josephus, he mentions James, the brother of Jesus, And Josephus wasn't a Christian, so he wouldn't be using the term brethren, would he? So clearly, when he says brother of Jesus, maybe he just means brother of Jesus. But yeah, it's I don't know. But as far as Peter's concerned, I'm guessing Ehrman would say Peter was probably one who had the visionary experience, and then he told everybody else. But even that, there's no basis for that. Most of what I'm finding is most of what Ehrman is talking about in his book, How Jesus Became God, is he takes the actual historical documents that we have, the Gospels, Paul's letters, and anytime there's a reference to the traditional story that we're familiar with, he finds ways to dismiss them, and then he basically comes up with his own fabricated story to put in its place to try to convince people that now Ehrman thinks Jesus was a real person, but then he was a failed prophet who was killed, and then his disciples were so grieved that they eventually had this experience, and then they changed things, everything, and it's just I'm more and more amazed at how badly Ehrman makes his arguments. I'm trying to think of a good example that I was just
Well,
read right.
even if we just look at the psychology of it, I mean, you think about ourselves. If I had a vision or something like that occurred, am I going to want to worship illegally for decades and risk being beaten and being chased around and stoned and everything else? Am I going to do that for just a hallucination or a vision? I don't think so. But if in a case where they actually said they were with Jesus for 40 days, so.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I to give a benefit of a doubt, I could imagine if somebody was insane enough, to think that, Charles Manson, he was nuts, and he had his, group of small followers, but that's not going to catch on massively. If you have you can have a nut job over here who claims to have seen a vision, and maybe he gets a few people following him. But more times than not, those kind of devolve into cults, and they kind of separate themselves out from everybody. And that's not what you had with the early Christian movement. They were in the major cities throughout the Roman Empire, and I was going to say something else. Lost my train of thought. It happens.
Well, I think what's interesting is even if we go into the book of Acts and we look at what Gamaliel said and what he said with respect to the persecutions of Peter, he said, leave these men alone, because if this, he noted how some other people who maybe were similar to Jesus in some way, how their followings died down. But he said, if Christianity is true, God will make sure it keeps going. And again, like we know, by the year 313, there were between 5 and 6 million adherents. So clearly, this did not die down. So that just shows you.
And that's one of the things, just from a historical perspective. In the first century, there were a lot of Jewish zealot leaders who claimed to be the Messiah, who tried to revolt against Rome, and some of them had significant followings. But in every single case, Rome came in and basically killed their leaders, and that following died out. Because, if you have a leader who claims to be the Messiah, but then he's killed, he's clearly not the Messiah, and you're not going to keep going with that, movement. But then you have with Jesus's followers, they claimed he was the Messiah. He was killed by Rome, just like everybody else. But then for some reason, that movement gained steam and kept going. And so you have to ask yourself, historically, why did that happen? Because every other messianic movement in the first century was, squelched. But this one wasn't, even after they killed the leader, supposedly. And so that's the one thing I don't see skeptics like Ehrman or Carrier or others adequately explaining. And if you read N.T. Wright's massive book, Jesus and the Resurrection of the Son of God, the resurrection is for me, the most logical reason why the movement would keep going. They really believed he was physically resurrected. and therefore they didn't have to fear death, in a nutshell. But I see somebody has written something. Let me see here. Charles Manson had a load of followers who did crazy things. Yes, and they were put in prison.
Actually, the second comment from Paul, and thank you, Paul and Craig. I see both of you on here. The second comment from Paul, I think we should comment on, because I think that's something that a lot of people do bring up. They think that they're under the assumption that because people were living 2,000 years ago, that they're all uneducated, they're goat herders, they're Bronze Age. It's a Bronze Age mythology. We've heard it all. Can you speak to, and what do you know about the education levels? Because I know, for example, Matthew, the tax collector, had to have a certain level of education to be a tax collector that would not be an uneducated second grade education. And the fishermen of those times, it's my understanding that that also was a very respected and good profession. So you want to speak to some of that?
Well, yeah, with Matthew, a tax collector, he would have been educated, and Luke was a doctor, a Gentile convert doctor, so he was educated. But even you could even take the education out of it and think, most people, I would like 99.9% of people, even back then, if, somebody came up to you and said, hey, let's put it this way, back in the mid 90s when the Oklahoma City bombing, Timothy McVeigh,
Yes.
If I know he was put to death. I don't know exactly how. Let's say he was electric chair. I know he wasn't electric chair, but I'll just say that. Let's say he was executed. If like 2-3 days later, some of his family members, went on CNN and started saying, oh, Timothy McVeigh was resurrected and glory be to God. Nobody's going to believe that, and just like back then, to claim that somebody who was crucified was resurrected from the dead, especially in the Roman Greek influenced world, nobody's going to believe that. That's a stupid thing to claim. And so it doesn't matter what education level you are, that very claim itself was a ridiculous claim to begin with. It's not going to be something that, even if you're a fisherman in Galilee or wherever, and somebody made the claim to you, you're not going to find too many people go, oh, really? Oh, okay. You just claimed God came back from the dead. That happens all the time. Well, no, it's a remarkably, for the most part, ridiculous claim to make. So have you been to the Middle East and met people today? 20 years ago, I went to Israel. But the point is, for the most part, if you just go up to people and claim somebody they were familiar with who was killed, resurrected, most people are not going to just readily believe that. That's the point.
And that's actually a really good point. And that, people like Richard Carrier make the assumption that everyone was gullible, but in reality, people are the same then as they are now. There's the brains, our brains aren't any more evolved right now. We're not any different. They had the same intellectual capabilities and capacities. And I'm sure there was a certain level of skepticism, because when you first hear that, you'd think, what this, so what do you think it took them? Like, what do you think, knowing that many of them were like Luke and were highly educated? What do you think what was the thing that you think sold them on this whole idea?
Well, I think, well, let me say one thing first. I think speaks to, our modern arrogance. We tend to think because we have technology, that therefore that means we are more sophisticated in our thinking. Oh, they didn't have a cell phone back then, therefore they're going to believe if somebody rose from the dead easily because they're idiots. That kind of mentality. It's like, that's not necessarily the truth. Like what you said, first century people, they might not have had the technology we have today, but that doesn't mean they were just yokels who just would believe anything you told them. Flying spaghetti monster. Okay, no, they're still people. But as far as what would convince people, I think oftentimes, even Christians in the modern world, we tend to reduce the Christian faith to just whatever we can prove the resurrection happened. That's why they became Christians. Well, the the early Christians went out and preached the resurrection, that Jesus rose from the dead. But the thing that we often overlook is that the thing that convinced people to follow the movement wasn't just an intellectual, oh, I'm convinced that happened, even though I think they did. But when you read the Paul's letters and the New Testament as a whole, it's clear that it's the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. It actually, there was the power of the Holy Spirit worked in people's lives, where even if they couldn't intellectually understand a resurrection, because let's face it, who can? I mean, that's kind of a difficult one. There was something about the Christian community and the way they, there was something different about it. That's the best way I can say it off the fly. But it wasn't just Paul going out like, let me give you the top 10 proofs that Jesus really rose from the dead. Okay, I'm convinced. It wasn't like that. It was, the resurrection wasn't just a fact they tried to prove. The resurrection, the Christian proclamation is that the resurrection of Jesus opened the door to a new understanding of existence. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Kind of? Yeah.
Yes, and I think you're right about the Holy Spirit working through people. I think that's a great point. And it also, I think that another point is that the people during those times, the Christians were living a very good life. They were a very, very clean living people, doing well by others, very peaceful. So I think their example in a time where people were pagans and some of the decisions that were made were worshiping idols and that kind of thing. I think the difference that the Christians posed between them and pagans, I think that kind of made a big difference with a lot of people.
No, yeah. I mean, for example, they gave women a lot more respect, positions of leadership in the early church. A lot of people make a big deal that Paul didn't, work to fight slavery. Well, he was an itinerant preacher. He couldn't do anything, but what he did is he encouraged the believers to treat, if they had slaves, to treat them as fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, and eventually it was Christianity that eventually put an end to the ancient practice of paganism, and so the quality of life that people saw in the Christian communities was attractive. One other, I don't know if you read this book, but this is a really good book by Rodney Stark called The Triumph of Christianity.
No, I haven't. I'll pick that up.
Oh, it's great. And I think he's a sociologist, but it's a historical overview of what led to Christianity eventually becoming what it is today. And one of the things he mentioned about what led to more and more converts, if you will, is in the pagan world, plagues were always coming through cities and stuff, because they didn't have the sanitation we do today. And most of the times when there was some kind of massive plague, the rich and powerful people would just flee the cities, get out in the countryside to be safe and just let the poor people die in the cities. That's kind of because that's how pagans viewed the plebeians. They were worthless, let them die. And one of the things that the Christians were known for is they stayed in the cities and ministered and tended to the sick. And therefore, that kind of charity and putting your life on the line for the people who are doomed really impressed people. And on top of that, he mentions this, by doing that, when you're exposed to sickness, your body, builds up more of an immunity, and so he kind of surmises that a lot of pagans probably saw a lot of these Christians aren't dying. They're in plagued places and they're not dying. Therefore, God must be with them. And now we would explain it, whereas they got more immunity toward it. But it was that act of Christian charity toward the unlovable and the low and the lowly in that society. That was a big reason why it led to the rise of Christianity over paganism. Because in paganism, life was cheap. If you're not going to be valued, whatever. But Christians actually, because they believed in the resurrection of Jesus, that therefore that the created order was good and that human beings have dignity and worth, that even the lowest among us is worthy of charity and love. That was the thing that convinced more and more people to become more Christians, because it put more of a value on human life. Even on something like, I know this is contentious today, but the practice of abortion. In the Roman world, abortion was commonplace. And not only that, if a woman gave birth to a girl or unwanted baby, they would literally take that new baby to the trash dump and throw it out, which, infanticide. And in doing that, a lot, then what would happen, some pagans would go and find these babies and raise them to be like prostitutes in temples. It's child prostitution. Whereas the Christians, they would often go and find these babies and raise them as their own. And so, because human life was sacred, they saw that kind of behavior as a horrible thing. So it's that kind of value for human life that was very appealing to a lot of people. So.
That's really interesting, because that also speaks to the type of person Jesus was. Because when he came, again, he was working in the pits more than the pedestals. He was working with women who were prostitutes and lower levels in society, and women themselves were in very low levels. So you made a really good point on the treatment of women back then. Christianity did a lot to change perceptions of women. It changed perceptions of slavery. Early hospitals were founded by Christians, so that's another point. And then some of our greatest educational universities in the world were founded by Christians. So Christians have made a good contribution to society.
Oh yeah, and those are the kind of things that Rodney Stark brings up in that book. Is a lot of the stuff that we just take for granted. That's humanitarian, of course. Yeah, it's in our modern world, we just take it for granted as being humanitarian. But in the pagan world, establishing hospitals for the common people was unheard of. The universities was started by, churches. The Catholic Church started the university, basically. And so a lot of the stuff that we just take for granted was as a product of what those early Christians were doing. They really changed the perspective of what is good. I mean, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. So let's go to and I know you said you specialize in the Old Testament, so maybe we should chat a little bit about that. Of course, someone's written something about Deuteronomy here. I'm not sure what the exact verse is. But what do you think about it? What do you think about, because we have a sets of laws in the Old Testament, and then when Jesus came, he had the New Covenant. But what do you think, or how do you respond to people who point out some of the laws that were in the Old Testament that spoke to things like rape and slavery and that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Well, let's see if I can do this quickly. First of all, you have to always see, whenever you're looking at laws like Deuteronomy, you have to understand those laws. You have to understand the culture in which those laws were produced. We cannot expect that ancient people living, 3,000 years ago are going to have the exact same moral sense that we do today. Some of it is kind of culturally different. So I mean, I can't think of anything off the top of my head right now, but there are certain taboos that we find abhorrent today that in the ancient world were not considered horrible. Whereas there are certain things that we allow today that in the ancient world were horrendous. That makes sense?
Yes. Yes.
And so we can't impose our moral qualms back to an ancient people. You have to judge them by their culture standards. And therefore, when you get to a lot of the laws in the Torah, from our perspective, some of them seem kind of brutal, kind of, slaves and, that kind of stuff. And women's rights, which I can't really, let me see if I can find that, Paul. You informed them intelligence, the culture was so different. Well, of course the culture was different, and this is what I'm getting to. In the ancient Near East, women had zero rights. They were property completely. Same thing with slaves. Every culture in the ancient world practiced slavery. Everyone. The whole idea that you had, you couldn't fathom a culture without it. That's how every culture was. And so therefore, because ancient Israel was part of that ancient culture, they're going to adopt many of the same institutions and mores of that culture. But what you see in the Torah is how can I say, a tweaking of those things. Whereas we might read some of the laws in Deuteronomy about women as being oppressive, but at that time, those type of stipulations in the Torah were actually seen as a moral advancement over what had been in the other cultures. And therefore, we would, if I could put it this way, we would have never gotten to the point we are today if back then Israel and then the early church as well, with what they changed, hadn't taken those initial steps. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, and actually that brings up one of the points that I get a lot on Twitter is the idea of women marrying their rapist. And there's a verse that basically says that if someone is to rape a woman, and it's my understanding that one of the reasons why that person could be obligated to marry her if that's what she wanted and what her dad wanted, basically. Something like that. So would you want to speak to that as far as your perceptions on that particular idea?
Well, first of all, I noticed Deuteronomy 20, 28, and 29, Paul. There is no 28 and 29 in Deuteronomy. It only goes up to 20. So maybe it's another verse you're thinking of. But again, yeah, in that culture, women were married off according to what their parents decided to. They didn't have much of a choice. But also in that culture, if sexual purity was a little more important to them back then. If a man took a woman, and violated her, she would have been seen as, unclean for the rest of her life, because in that culture. So therefore, in the Torah, when you have a law that says if you do that to a woman, if you have sex with her outside of marriage, it's your responsibility as a man to marry her and take care of her for the rest of her life. It was a means of protecting the woman to be taken care of in that culture, because if not, she would have been an outcast. So we see verses like that, and let's face it, as soon as you say rape, we tend to think of, violent, aggressive rape that we have, mentioned today, and it happened back then, but it's not always the exact same thing, if that makes sense. I don't know how else to explain it. But back then, the point was, if a man had sex with a woman, it was his responsibility to take her into his house and care for her as a wife and give her some respectability. Because in that culture, if he didn't marry her, she would have been, outcast for the rest of her life. And so those laws, which seem regressive to us, in that culture were actually means of protecting the well-being of women, given the circumstances of the time.
That makes sense.
We wouldn't want to practice those laws today, because women have more freedom, and you could, be more independent now, because our cultures are different. But
so what's your take? And I know some of the other conversations we've had lately, and I think someone sent this question on Twitter, had to do with the global flood. And what are your perceptions? And I know this will get us into Genesis a little bit, and also talking about the interpretation of the word Yom, Y-O-M.
Yeah, well, with the flood itself, I mean, I'm doing this month-long debate thing on Facebook on this, right?
Yes, yeah. I need to watch that after.
Yeah. The big issue is, when it comes to Noah's flood, is it was a literal worldwide flood? Most people who hold to that are kind of young Earth creationists, and they think there was a literal worldwide flood 4,000 years ago. Or was it like a literal local flood in Mesopotamia? Or in my case, I think it's not meant to be a historical story. It's a takeoff of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, but the Israelite story is using that story to teach something different about who God is, basically. And so I read, is it Philip? Was that Philip's account that he sent?
Yes.
I think he basically argued that indications could have been a worldwide flood. I just think when it comes to Noah's flood, that it is it's problematic. And the way I'm because I'm doing this debate right now, a whole bunch of things are kind of going through right now. Basically, the problem with claiming it was a worldwide flood, a literal worldwide flood 4,000 years ago, is that if you make that claim, if you think that's what it is, then you are making a claim of something that happened in the natural world, physically. Therefore, if it did, we would find physical evidence and indications of that happening. And the fact is, there just isn't evidence of a worldwide flood 4,000 years ago, despite what Ken Ham says. And on top of that, there's so many other things attached to that claim that people often overlook that just make that claim untenable. And I'll just give you one example. Think of a timeline. This just, to me, this did it more than anything. Young Earth creationists claim that the flood happened roughly 2400 BC. Okay, so if you're watching, think of a timeline, 2400 BC. And then they claim after that, Noah came off the ark, the animals all speciated, and then you had the Tower of Babel at about 2240 BC. So like 160 years later. That's how they put it in their timeline. And then they think the calling of Abraham happened around 2100 BC. So in the Young Earth creationist timeline, to argue for a worldwide flood, think of all those things that have to have happened between 2400 BC and 2100 BC. Those original animals on the ark had to have speciated, or let's just use the word evolved, enough to where within 300 years we have modern animals, because they do exist by the time of Abraham. That is like hyper evolution on crack cocaine. That is impossible. On top of that, they claim that there was not many ice ages, but there was one ice age that happened between the flood and the Tower of Babel. So within 160 years, there was one singular ice age that killed all the dinosaurs that came off of the ark. And then on top of that, then you get the Tower of Babel. And this is another astounding claim, is the question of, what about the Neanderthals? Okay. Clearly, they were related to modern humans, but they're different. They had their own genome. According to Young Earth creationists, the Neanderthals were a group of people who were dispersed from Babel, who were so isolated from the rest of humanity that they developed their own genome over time, and then somehow came back in contact with the rest of humanity, interbred with modern humans. That's why some Europeans have like 2% Neanderthal DNA, that stuff. And then they died out. So we have to believe, to that timeline, that from 2240 BC to 2100 BC, within a span of 140 years, that it's possible for a people group to be isolated, develop their own genome, get repopulated, interbreed, and then go extinct. That is just impossible. But they're forced to have it in that tight time frame in order to make the universal flood in 2400 BC to work. It just doesn't, and so yeah, the worldwide flood doesn't work. And then as far as the local flood goes, I mean, I think probably the flood stories were probably inspired by some kind of flood in Mesopotamia that they came up with the stories, but I don't think it was meant to be a historical, literal story. I think it strains the text too much. In the text, it is a worldwide flood, but I just don't think the text is making a historical claim. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I agree with you there. And actually, that does remind me, and just something, so if people didn't hear your last conversation, you visited Ken Ham's Ark. And didn't you say you saw some like dinosaurs in there mixing with the people? So you want to tell us what you saw at Ken Ham's Ark?
Oh gosh, I could show you clips like crazy. Yeah, I mean, Ken Ham's obsession seems to be that he has to prove that Noah had dinosaurs on the ark. I mean, and if you go to his creation museum, which is just down the road, everything's dinosaurs, how human beings and dinosaurs live together. I mean, like, he seems to think that's really important to prove. Yeah, and if you go on go to Hams Ark Encounter, they have like obviously not real animals, but fake. What do you call them?
Yeah, like
Models, dinosaurs
stone
and
figures or something.
yeah, yeah, dinosaurs in cages with Noah's daughter-in-law feeding them, and it's just
That's lunacy. I
it
shouldn't
is.
laugh, but that's so crazy.
It's and at one point, and I wasn't there when he had this up, but I know he has a new diorama somewhere on the Ark Encounter of supposedly what life was like in the pre-flood civilization. Again, because he's taken everything has to be historical, and there's like a diorama of like a Colosseum, almost looks like a Roman Colosseum, but makes it look more ancienty. And in this diorama, there's like a big giant who clearly is supposed to be a Nephilim, who's dressed up in what looks like, not Roman gear, but, military gear that we associate from that time period. And he's a giant with a spear and he's holding a woman, and there's another woman crying out. And on the corner of this diorama, like a cage is opening, like velociraptors coming out because they're feeding the innocent people to the velociraptors. And like, what do you say to that? I mean, and he tends to think that if you don't believe that, then you're doubting the Bible. Well, it's like, where is that in the Bible? It doesn't say that, and it's just so ridiculous that he, in order to try to claim that there was a historical flood 4,000 years ago, everything in the Ark Encounter is made up. He's spouting fictions to try to prove that it's history, which is kind of problematic if you ask me.
I agree. So what is your interpretation of the word yam, and how do you use that to speak to how old you believe the earth is and the universe?
Well, yeah, that's another big thing he makes a deal of. And a lot of people get into this big argument about yom, which means day. Ken Ham thinks it's a literal 24-hour, 6-day week in Genesis 1. If you don't believe that, you're doubting God. And then you have like old earth creationists who say, no, these days could mean, big ages, time periods of years. I think both are wrong-headed in their explanation of Yom. To be blunt, in Genesis 1, Yom means day. I mean, it's 7 days, 6 days, 7 days. I mean, that's clearly what it means. But it's not speaking to science, and so, and it says the 6 days of Genesis 1. Yeah, it means 6 days, but they're not meant to be taken in. How can I put this? It does mean 6 days, but it's not making a scientific statement of literally this is exactly when he did it. So you don't have to say it's an age or a day. Clearly in the story, it's a day, but the story isn't doing science to begin with. So it's kind of like the Noah's flood story. Clearly in the Noah's flood story, the waters covered the entire earth. But the Noah's flood story isn't meant to be taken as a literal historical account of that literally happening. In the story, that happens, but it's not meant to be history. An example would be kind of like you take a parable, like the prodigal son story. Yeah. In the prodigal son, time passes in the story. The son does this and does that. But the story itself isn't meant to be history. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I think that's how we need to read those early chapters of Genesis. And trying to get into like scientific debates over what does Yom mean, age or literal day. I think people are trying to miss the point. They're still trying to read in our modern scientific questions into the ancient texts. So yeah.
Yes, and we do see some of that. So and you mentioned before, I mean, you've actually kind of even lost your job that you had before because of your views on young earth creationism. So so I feel really bad about that. That's pretty sad that
Yeah, well, and the funny thing is with that, I mean, I wrote that, I kind of briefly mentioned what happened in the opening chapter of my book, The Heresy of Ham. When I wrote the rough draft, there's actually like 2 other chapters that I took out that kind of go through the details of what happened, which is kind of painful. And it was ludicrous because I was teaching Bible at a Christian school. I wasn't even teaching the topic. It was just, I had happened to see the Bill Nye Ken Ham debate, and on my personal blog, I had written an analysis of that debate, and I just said, hey, some of the Ken Ham stuff doesn't quite make sense. Wasn't teaching it in school. I wasn't making a big deal about it ever. And then the Young Earth Creationist headmaster found out that I wrote about it on my blog, and that alarmed him, and he thought I was speaking with the voice of the serpent, and lost my job over this. And I was like, at that point, I didn't even know much about Ken Ham, just a little bit. And so when he made such a big deal over this, and I still remember thinking, this is weird. This is just bizarre. Who thinks this is that important of a thing? And then I started reading more and more about Ken Ham, and it just blew my mind that anybody could take this guy seriously. But yet he's taken really seriously, unfortunately, in a segment of evangelicalism. And I think that's really dangerous.
How many people do you think are young Earth creationists? And I know, I think, and would you say it's mostly people in the United States? Is this a
pretty much? It's mostly a United States evangelical fundamentalist thing, and I think worldwide, I think it's a very small percentage. I mean, put it this way: Orthodoxy, Catholicism, most Protestant denominations do not hold to it. But if you have grown up in a fundamentalist evangelical church subculture, you think that's everything, and so fractionally, it's a smaller fraction, but it has a huge influence in a lot of evangelical churches, unfortunately, because the way it's presented is, this is a foundational tenet of the faith. If you don't believe the earth is 6,000 years old, then you're calling God into question. And so they've made it a tenet of the faith, in which it isn't, so.
No, to me, it seems like a minor part of the faith. I as far as my interpretation of the very few chapters in Genesis, I think that our faith centers around Jesus's resurrection. Now, that's the foundation. If they were able to prove that the resurrection did not occur, well, then we have something to talk about.
Right. And if anybody who knows anything about church history, we have writings of a lot of early church fathers, and a lot of them do comment on those early chapters of Genesis. And it's very clear they had different views on how to read them. And the young Earth creationists claim that everybody throughout church history believed in a young Earth, and that was a fundamental tenet of the faith. That's just fundamentally not true. Because you have Origen, who's like one of the first theologians in the Christian history. I mean, he mocks people who reads those early chapters literally. He says that's the dumbest thing, So, but in any case, the point was, people had different views on those early chapters, and nobody made that a fundamental tenet of the faith. That's something you can disagree with. So, if somebody believes the earth is 6,000 years old, I think they're wrong, but I'm not going to call them a heretic over it, If they say the earth is only 6,000 years old, and if you don't believe it, you're, denying Jesus, well, then, yeah, that's heresy, because you're making that a fundamental tenet of the faith. So, I see a question. Paul, why is Noah's flood not literal? What makes you read it that way? Basically, it's because we have other flood myths in the ancient Near East, which Noah's flood is really much alike, like the Epic of Gilgamesh and Atrahasis. The ancient people didn't write; they weren't concerned with writing history. They had stories about the gods, which we now label as myth, and then they used those stories to kind of legitimate the authority of the kings. And so nobody thinks Atrahasis or Gilgamesh is trying to tell history. And therefore, my thinking is, since Noah is a lot like that, I don't think we should consider the Noah story historical either. It's doing something different. I'm not dismissing it as unimportant. I'm saying it's not attempting to do history. I hope that makes sense, Paul.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
That I'm just thinking of, I was kind of going back in my mind to some of the stuff from Richard Carrier and some of his ideas that he had. And one of them that I think you briefly touched on, but you didn't get into so much, and I think would be interesting to talk about, is his views on the empty tomb, because he thinks that Jesus was just buried in a mass grave, and he discounts the whole Joseph of Arimathea. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on are of that topic.
Oh, of him dismissing the empty tomb mass grave
Yeah,
thing?
I mean, what do, from your views as a biblical scholar and looking at what the Bible has said about the empty tomb, and then Joseph of Arimathea?
Well, funny thing, Bart Ehrman actually makes the same claim there. But basically, as you know, a biblical scholar, biblical historian, when you look, you have to look at the texts we have. Okay. Now, it's true that a lot of times people who were crucified weren't buried, and sometimes they were left and eaten by dogs. You know, and it is true that a lot of times people who were executed were buried in mass graves. That happened most of the time. That is true. But we have in the Gospels and in Paul's letters, well, let's just stick to the Gospels, the account of Jesus's death and, you know, crucifixion and death. But they also say that Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin who did bury him. Yeah. And then even at the end of Mark, when the women go to the tomb, you know, the angel appears to the tomb and says, "Hey, look, the tomb's empty." So you have in the sources that we do have, the fact that he was buried by a guy named Joseph of Arimathea, that's there in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're all there. The only way you can get to there was no Joseph of Arimathea, he was buried in a mass grave, is you have to take the sources that we have and just say, no, I'm going to dismiss them and make up my own story. And so Carrier and Ehrman, what they're saying literally is not supported by any evidence, any written evidence we have, basically, if you just try to be as objective, historical about it. The only evidence we have about Jesus's death and burial are the Gospels. That's it. And if you get rid of those, you're just making things up, you know. So, yeah.
Yeah, especially the empty tomb, and that does speak to. Have you looked at any extra biblical sources? Because I've actually posted things about the 9 secular sources we have within 150 years of Jesus's crucifixion that provide support for many of the elements of the New Testament. Have you looked at any of those sorts of things or any articles?
Well, yeah, I mean, I know, like, you have like Tacitus and Pliny the Younger.
Pliny the Younger, yeah.
Younger elder. Yeah, I mean, they clearly mentioned there was a Jesus, that he really was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and that he was buried, and that his followers claim he was resurrected, basically. So yeah, you have the other sources acknowledging that that's what the early followers were claiming, right? And none of them say, oh no, the early followers are wrong, Jesus was buried in a mass grave. You have none of that. And so again, there's nothing we have supports Carrier and Ehrman's claim that he was buried in a mass grave and that Joseph of Arimathea didn't exist. I mean, there's nothing there.
Well, that's actually a good point. And that brings up another comment that I had this morning on Twitter. I had a really active morning on Twitter with people. First place, a lot of people want to get me fired at my job. So I've been getting some crazy tweets about, with my school tagged in, which I find extremely unpleasant.
Yeah,
but yeah, it's terrible. But anyway, so another person said, well, Paul said all of this stuff in the epistles and in his writings, but Paul did not mention this, like identified a few things that Paul didn't say, trying to discount everything that Paul did say. And I think that is a major fallacy that I've seen in reasoning.
Well, again, Ehrman says that very thing. He mentions when Paul, I think it's in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, when, I'm going to tell you what was passed down to me, that how does it go? Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and he was raised on the 3rd day, yada, yada. And Ehrman goes, oh, you see, Paul doesn't mention Joseph of Arimathea, therefore Joseph of Arimathea is clearly, not a historical person. Like, creeds by definition are distilling the basic fundamental facts. They're not going to give you the gospel narrative of everything. So that's just illogical. And then Paul just says he was raised. He doesn't mention an empty tomb. Like, well, Paul was a Pharisee. And for Paul to say Jesus was resurrected, that kind of implies an empty tomb already. He doesn't need to point that out, you know? And so yeah, I think it's people who, if I was an honest atheist, I would say, yes, the early church from the very beginning claimed this, this, and this. I don't agree with it, but clearly this is what they claimed. And I would just leave it at that. I wouldn't try to explain away what they obviously are saying, you know.
Yeah, because then it does get to questions of honesty. I mean, I don't want to pick on them for that, but it does make you question and say, you know, if I went to meet a friend for lunch and I wrote about it and I didn't mention the fact that the friend came from her house to meet me at lunch, does it mean that she didn't come from her house to meet me at lunch?
Right. Yeah, exactly. They're straining to see stuff to pick apart. So yeah, I think it's really problematic. So yeah, I don't know.
Do you want to speak at all to one of the things that people have pointed out in apologetics that shows or helps to demonstrate the validity of the Bible is the fact that there's some embarrassing testimony in there, and certainly surrounding Jesus's ministry, there was some embarrassing testimony, and even like the four women discovering. I don't mean the four women, the four Gospels saying the women discovered the empty tomb. Do you want to speak to any of the embarrassing issues of the time?
Well, I think that speaks to the credibility of the writings, and you get this in the Old Testament. I mean, just do the whole Old Testament. If you were a Jew and you had your Old Testament as your scriptures, and you read through most of your Old Testament, most of the Old Testament is telling you that you and your people screwed up over and over again. It's not putting you up on a pedestal at all. You know, I mean, that's brutal honesty. And so the same thing with the Gospels. Those kind of things, yeah, mentioning the women being the first to see the tomb, mentioning that the disciples clearly didn't get it most of the time. There's one of my favorite novels is by John Irving. It's A Prayer for Owen Meany. I don't know if you've ever read it, but
no, I haven't.
Oh, it's wonderful. I won't go into the whole story, but there's a character in the story, the main character, who's kind of like the Christ figure. But when he's a kid, he's in a Bible class with his fellow students, and I can't quote it, but the way it's put is just so blue collar. I appreciate it. It was like, of course the disciples are stupid. They're always screwing up, you know. But just because the disciples were some blank disciples, it doesn't mean that, you know, Jesus didn't exist. Or he just put it in such basic ways. But yeah, it's when you read the Gospels, they're not trying to sugarcoat things. I mean, there are embarrassing things in it where if you were making this up, you wouldn't put those in, you know.
That's true, because the part where they said Jesus' mother and then Jesus' brother showed up and at one point and they wanted to stop him, and other ideas with the woman with the hair washing Jesus's feet, and that could be taken in different ways. So there are things that, you know, and Peter denying Jesus 3 times. These are things that if you were going to lie about it, you certainly, I mean, if you're going to craft a story to sell to people, you're certainly not going to put stuff like that in it.
Well, and I mean, just again, sometimes we're so familiar with the gospel story that we forget, quite frankly, how stupid it sounds. I mean, it does sound stupid. You know, if you were a pagan or a Jew at that time, the whole idea of, hey, you know that guy who's just crucified and brutally tortured? He's God. We're going to worship him. That sounds bizarre, you know? And so if you're going to try to gain followers, if you're going to try to gain Greek followers, you know, you're not going to come up with the idea of a resurrection because they think that's the dumbest thing possible. You know, they think, you know, the mortal coil is what you want to shed, you know, but the Jews don't know. This is God's good creation. He's going to redeem his good creation and he's going to show it to us. And here's the first example of it, the resurrection, you know. So what made you want to study, you know, as far as, have you always been a Christian? I think you've said you have always been a Christian. What made you want to go into this as a field of study? Well, yeah, I grew up in a Christian home. I went to a Christian high school. I always liked my Bible classes. I was one of those weird kids who kind of enjoyed them. Looking back, though, they weren't the best Bible classes. They were kind of crappy. But I was just interested in it. I was always interested in biblical stuff. But when I went to college, my undergraduate degree was in literature, because I always liked English literature as well. So I majored in English literature, got my teaching degree. Substitute taught for a couple of years, hated that. That's the worst thing anybody could ever do. I have stories. And I couldn't get a full-time job because I looked so young. I had no experience. When you're in your early 20s, you're frustrated with life. You don't know what you want to do. You think the world's going to come to an end and all that stuff. And I decided to go join the Peace Corps, get out of America. And I thought, this is what I'll do. I'll teach English as a second language, and I'll view the world, And I found myself in Kazakhstan, which is like middle of Central Asia. Not a lot to do there. And I still remember specifically, it was like in October of 1993. And I was realizing that I really don't like teaching English as a foreign language. It's kind of boring. I like literature. And when you teach English as a basic language, you're teaching people how to, hi, my name is Vladimir, really basic stuff that isn't the most, I realized I didn't want to do that. So I was having this crisis of what do I want to do with my life? And I still remember this. I was sitting in my room, where I was living, my apartment room, writing a letter to my parents about like, I don't want to do with my life, that kind of thing. And I happened to be listening to a Christmas tape because I didn't have a lot of options in Kazakhstan. And there's kind of an epiphany for me. And there was a song that came on, O Come, O Come, Emmanuel. That it was by a string quartet. It was just nobody singing, just a string quartet of O Come, O Come, Emmanuel. And it was like this light bulb went off in my head that said, I've always loved doing biblical studies. I don't know what I want to do with it, but I want to go back. When I go back to America, I want to get a graduate degree in biblical studies and just learn it because that's what I love. I just love learning about it. And even if I don't do anything with it, even if I somehow go back and just teach English, I'm going to pursue where my interests are. And so that's what got me into it. So when I got back to America, I looked into graduate school. I went to Regent College in Vancouver, got a New Testament master's degree. And then from there, I taught for 4 years in California, English and Bible. And I ended up getting a second master's degree in Old Testament. And I went back to teach more at the high school level. And it just then I came here to Alabama, where I was just teaching biblical worldview for 8 years at the high school. And then I got fired. And a door opened up at the local university. So now, since I do have a PhD, I'm kind of teaching at the university level, but I never intended to do that. I was happy just teaching high school, and I just wanted to learn it just for the sake of learning. And just the way life goes, hopefully I'll get a full-time college, position at some point. But so, yeah, that's kind of what the deal is.
I had, it's funny you say you sort of had an epiphany, because that happened to me with 9/11. So 9/11 occurred, and I thought to myself, what am I doing with my life? I wasn't really enjoying it that much. I was doing things like real estate and other stuff like that. And I thought, I'm just not really enjoying this. So I had a master's degree, and I sent my resume over to a local university for an adjunct position. And miracle of miracles, 4 days before class was to begin, in an introduction to marketing class, I got a call from the dean, and he said they lost the person who was supposed to teach this class, and the poor guy only had 4 days to get somebody in that position. And I felt like the luckiest person in the world. Zero experience. I went in there and I taught the class, and I loved it. So I went back to school because of that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I was actually just starting my second master's degree on 9/11. It was supposed to be the first day of class. It was in British Columbia. I did my master's programs in Canada because there were some good schools there. But yeah, it was the very first day we were supposed to have classes. That's when 9/11 happened.
Wow.
And so, yeah. Interesting.
9/11 is kind of funny because we all remember where we were. I mean, I remember being in the car driving down the road, listening to Howard Stern, of all people.
I can tell you the whole story of that. But here's an interesting thing about 9/11. Maybe well, we went a little bit longer. Is that the from 9/11 the phrase "Let's roll," that famous catchphrase that the one of the guys on the plane, Flight 93, that went down in Pennsylvania. That was the last thing you heard of him before they stormed the cockpit. I knew that guy. I went to high school with him, Todd Beamer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He was in my high school class at the Christian high school I went to. Yeah, we were on the same baseball team and everything. He was a lot better than me. He was like the big athletic stud, and I was kind of like the bench warmer. But yeah. So when the whole thing happened, you were watching on TV that day, and like, okay, whatever. Kind of shocked and stuff. And then the next day, my sister sent me a message, and she said, "Hey, did you know Todd Beamer in high school?" I'm like, "Yeah, he was on Flight 93." I'm like, "Oh," I mean, it just kind of brought it home a little more. It was kind of crazy. Now, I wasn't like best buddies with him. We weren't buddies or anything, but he was in my class. It was a pretty small class, so it was just kind of a weird connection there.
Yeah, that definitely hits home. That's definitely,
Yeah.
wow. So I guess we should maybe move towards closing. I know that people can find you. Do you want to share where people can find you on your social media and on your website and Facebook, whatever you want to share?
Well, I do have a blog called Resurrecting Orthodoxy. It's just at joeledmondanderson.com. And basically, I use that as a forum for me to just kind of write about things that interest me. And right now, I'm in the middle of going through kind of an extended book analysis of Bart Ehrman's book, How Jesus Became God. I'm kind of picking that apart. I've done series on Richard Carrier. I've done a bunch of series on young earth creationism, as well as biblical studies stuff and just variety of things. So I have that. At this point, that's the only real thing I have on social media. I have a YouTube channel that has a couple things on there, but there's not much there. I'm sure you can find me on YouTube if you want to watch a few funny videos.
Oh, I will look for you on YouTube. And I know you're on Twitter because I've seen you there. That's how I met you.
Yeah, YouTube, I actually have footage of me at the Ark encounter.
Oh, so, now that's worth it. I think I'm going to go on and share that on Twitter. That'd be fun.
You can find it there. Yeah, my friend and I, we went there like 4 days after it opened. So it was quite a trip.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So people can find you there. And now you said you've got something going on Facebook, a debate. Did you want to mention?
Right now, it's a Facebook page is called Preterist Smackdown. I don't get the title, but well, I do. But anyway, they're having like this month-long debate I'm a part of about Noah's flood. So it started last week. We did opening statements. This upcoming week will be the first rebuttals. And there'll be a second rebuttal, then a closing statement by the end of the month. So you can go to Preterist Smackdown and join, and then you can read the views. It's my view, and then the other two views is one is arguing that's a worldwide flood, another one is that's just a local flood. And I'm saying it's not historical. It's not meant to be historical.
That's interesting. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we?
No, I think that's probably about it. The hour went by fast.
I know, and I really enjoy having you on. So you bring a wealth of information, and I'm sure that everyone who listens, who has listened now or will be listening in the future, will be happy to hear you and happy to know that they can find you and find your writings. And I like sharing your stuff that you've written on Bart Ehrman and Richard Carrier, because you do a good job of explaining why that stuff is not true.
Well, I think one of the things that if I could brag on myself for a second. Hey, bench warmer Joel Anderson, thanks for the thanks, Glow. What was I going to say? One of the things I think I do well, and I think I developed this by teaching high school for 16 years, is I think I explain things in a very easy to understand way. Where a lot of people who, PhD scholars who write at the academic level, sometimes they write over everybody's head. You have no idea what the crap they're talking about. And I think what I had to learn to do teaching high school is take the stuff I learned in graduate school and make it understandable for teenagers. I think I've learned to just be very clear and hopefully entertaining as I write and talk and stuff. But So yeah, most of my stuff is pretty easy to understand, even the difficult stuff. So.
And that's really important. I noticed, like, for example, when you go to William Lane Craig's website, reasonablefaith.org, he's got a great website, and he's differentiated his scholarly work from just his popular work, and he's done that because he's got them written on. I mean, they're written on two different levels, so it's good that people have a place that they can go and just get something that's easy to understand.
Yeah. It's important. I mean, it's so anyway. Well, hopefully, go ahead.
Oh, I wanted to say, your last thing you mentioned, you also mentioned a couple of books. You mentioned Rodney Stark's book. Just for anyone who's listening, are there any other strong book recommendations you have for people who want to learn more about?
Off the top of my head, Rodney Stark. I loved the Rodney Stark book. That was really good. Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't think of any. I mean, there are plenty of good ones, but that's a big, thick one. That's pretty.
That's the good one. So I'll go ahead and I'll get that. I haven't read anything by Rodney Stark, so I'll add that to my list.
I really like that book. I remember reading, because what he does, and he has a whole bunch of other books as well, where he kind of, by going through the history of it, he kind of really takes on and demolishes a lot of what I would call the Enlightenment revisionist history of church history. You've heard it before. Like, atheists will come up like, "Oh, what about the Inquisition and the Crusades?" And he basically presents the history of what was actually going on and what records we have and what was actually done. And he doesn't sugarcoat things by saying they were all, peachy keen, lovely, but he kind of shows how a lot of that Enlightenment rhetoric about church history was really false. I'll give you one example. I don't know if he brought this up in his book, or I just know it. Typically, we're told, like, Christopher Columbus, he sailed around the world to prove the world was round because the Catholic Church was saying that it was flat. Well, anybody who knows history knows that the Catholic Church never taught that the earth was flat. That story of Christopher Columbus proving the world was round and had loggerheads with Catholic Church, that story was literally made up by Washington Irving in like the early 1800s. He made it up. He kind of wrote a fictional story, and it somehow got into our mainstream, and we think that's history, and it's not.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
No, it's actually, this is totally a side thing. You could probably find them online. I'm a Monty Python fan.
I am too.
Terry Jones, one of the guys, he has a master's in history, and he's done some stuff for, I think, the BBC, and I think you can find him online. Just YouTube Terry Jones Medieval Lives. And he did the series like 15 years ago or so, maybe more. I think 8 series about focus on the Middle Ages and a lot of the things we think about the dark times in the Middle Ages that are actually factually wrong. And they're very entertaining. They're kind of done in a Monty Python-like way. And he mentions the Columbus story, and those are just fun to watch. So.
Oh yeah, I agree. Well, thank you everyone who came in here. I see Paul, I think it looks like he left. Glow J, Craig's been on here. We've got some good people who've listened in and really appreciate it. And Joel, maybe we'll chat again sometime when you'd like to.
Maybe in the fall, because over the summer, it might be kind of tough with a 6-year-old running around, but
oh yeah.
we'll see. All right.
Got it. Bye. Thank you.